I just finished reading the gargantuan novel To Green Angel Tower by Tad Williams. I thought about reading this book in parts given its length. It's apparently up there with The War and Peace in its length, and it's neatly divided into 4 sections. But I was engaged enough that I wanted to just finish the book. The fact that I heavily used the audiobook in conjunction with the ebook helped with that. This book is not only long, but it is the culmination of a trilogy. It finished the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy. I have already reviewed the first 2 entries beforehand, and I will link them below. To briefly recap, I thought that the Dragonbone chair had potential, and it had an amazing climax. Stone of Farewell was not good, save for scatterings of scenes. It was basically the instantiation of middle book syndrome, but because my critique was simply that it did not need to exist, I was still committed to moving on to the last entry eventually. Right from the outset, I have to say that I love the title. It isn't the Green Angel Tower, it is To Green Angel Tower. It is not only different, but it implies action. It implies purpose, motion. This book has motion. But what about the actual story? Let's get to it. No spoilers. Plot 1. Going off of what I mentioned above, this book is actually very purposeful. Despite its length, I actually had a sense that the characters were going somewhere, even as the book took them all across Ostenard. And I think this book is almost the perfect reply to Stone of Farewell, in the sense that Stone of Farewell was a rambling mess that took the characters all over the place, but also seemingly had no purpose to it. To Green Angel Tower is how you construct the plot of an epic fantasy novel with an adventure bent to it. It is sprawling enough that the characters take you places, but focused enough that you understand well enough what the purpose of all of this is. Part of this has to do with the fact that there are major battles or escalations in action partway through the story. Stone of Farewell seemed to lack all of this. It lacked even a serious climax at the end. In the Stone of Farewell, I know I complained about the lack of a sense of progression, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that Stone of Farewell was simply not constructed to have any serious climaxes. In my little diagram where I talked about progression from A to H with all the signposts in between, those points need to be more than just escalations of action. The characters, or at least the story, need to know that the story is building to something, right? There needs to be some sort of internal knowledge that the reader can recognize. The knowledge of the coming action has to be built into the structure of the story itself. It cannot simply come from nowhere or at random points in the story. A story where characters see an army moving toward them as they wait in anticipation is far more compelling than one where characters are vaguely traveling south and are harried by hellions at various points throughout their journey. The former has focus, even if it is slow, while the latter is lacking focus. The Green Angel Tower was broken up into miniature goals and climaxes that the characters were forced to overcome one after the other, and they all built upon one another to the final climactic moments. Plot 2. I claim that Stone of Farewell did not need to exist when I finished that book, so I want to return to that question in this review and ask whether I still agree. I already answered it technically. I do. I'm not saying that nothing that happened in that book was useful. There are useful events that need to happen, like the turning of the Scythian and more, but what I am saying is that Williams could have seriously restructured his books to move some of the events in the second entry to the beginning of To Green Angel Tower. Frankly, I was only more convinced when I got to some sections of To Green Angel Tower at the very end, when the characters' travels started to pick up and even move at what felt like light speed. It wasn't bad writing. I'm not comparing it to Game of Thrones in Season 7. It was how I would have written a whole novel. The contrast to everything before was stark. The armies moved to the Hayhalt in a matter of chapters, which was madness in my eyes. Building off of this point, the rest of the novel could have been slimmed up to make room for a few necessary events that happened in Stone of Farewell. Williams showed that he was capable and willing to do what was necessary. All things considered, Stone of Farewell should not have existed. The Green Angel Tower should have been split in two to cover the last two entries. Characters. Simon. Simon continues to grow and become a capable man over the course of the novel. Basically, it's a quintessential coming of age. He is also not the only character this whole story rests upon. This was one of the main things that stood out to me. He is important to the story, but he is one of many important characters. One of the minor details that stood out to me were the interactions between him and one of the older knights that showed up in the book. I like the touch that Williams added, that this knight was worried or wary over the fact that Simon was climbing the social ladder too quickly, that more training was required. The knight wasn't being insulting, he was just, as I said, wary. But such it is in a time of war. This next part will mildly spoil the end. It's not much of a spoiler, because you can kind of guess, just based off of the nature of fantasy novels, and the fact that I'm talking about Simon. But if you want to avoid it, just skip to the time code on the screen. One major thing that I want to talk about that touches upon his character, and also upon other books that I follow in the wake of this one, is how Simon actually prepared himself for his position of leadership at the end of the story. To what extent did his trials and tribulation to actually prepare him to become a leader who has to make difficult decisions in his life? Given that this story is largely an adventure story, it wasn't about leadership at all. Joshua had to make all the hard decisions and struggle throughout the book. And this is where A Song of Ice and Fire comes in. I remember Martin making comments about wanting to write stories where characters are forced to learn how to rule. And I think this is kind of like meta commentary about Williams' books, maybe. I don't mean like in a passive aggressive manner. I just mean like in like a kind of literary critique manner. And you definitely kind of see this in the story. From John to Danny, you see characters being put into impossible situations, one similar to what Joshua is being put through. When I finished this story, I got the sense that Simon's story had more to it. But I guess there still is, right? There's another series, so Miriamel. Miri's story throughout this entire series has been particularly dark. From Stone of Farewell on into this, I think we are greeted with a story that might not be grim dark necessarily, but it provides an edge to the story that contrasts the rest of the elements. The book starts out where the last one left off, with her a prisoner of Aspides, and her situation is only made worse as certain revelations unfold. Miri 1. That said, I thought one revelation about Aspides was a bit heavy-handed, or at least potentially. It seemed to be reminiscent of young adult novels, where they have to make morally gray or even monstrous characters even more monstrous by adding another element. A specific comparison would be an episode of Star Wars The Clone Wars, where the perspective is the clone troopers. They, unfortunately, have a Jedi boss who thinks that Clone troopers are dispensable, and they have to deal with this. The setup is fine, but at the end, there is the obligatory revelation that this Jedi was a Sith all along. The story would have been more interesting if the villain had simply been a Jedi who thought clones were dispensable. Making him a Sith made the story too black and white. Something similar happened with the Spideys. Thankfully, Williams was nowhere near as heavy-handed as the example I gave. And he might have been able to balance it at the end. You can make a case in his defense. All the same, I think this is worth mentioning. Miri, too. We later get a plot with her and Simon that helps lay the groundwork for their future relationship. It is complex, and Spidey's looms in the background of it all. It also raises interesting questions about sex and consent, given what happened between Miri and Spidey's at the end of Stone of Farewell. Looking back on the scene between Spidey's and Miri, I would say that Spidey's took advantage of Miri's grief-ridden state so he could take her maidenhead. Additionally, there are repetitions of phrases like, quote, "she struggled," and "she cried out softly, unable to resist such implacability," and "felt her resistance melting before his strength and sureness," and "she gave herself up to him at last." These quotes, stripped of their context, stand out, and when placed side by side, it's even more stark. But even the first one is in a context that is at least abstract enough that it does not necessarily imply an outright physical struggle. At the same time, we get quotes like, "he whispered soothing things about her beauty," and "each curl of his hair was intricate, textured, and individual as a tree," and "his words, like caresses, were blind but inflaming," and "he would protect her from those who would harm her," he said. These both imply attraction and his seduction. Obviously, merely being attracted to someone is not consent, but the point is that the scene is abstract enough that it could be assault, or it could be persistent seduction, with the implication of internal struggle on Miri's part. These two contrasting phrases are interwoven between each other to make a clear interpretation almost impossible. For example, "each curl of his hair was intricate, textured, and individual as a tree. His head seemed a forest, his dark form looming like a distant mountainside. She cried out softly, unable to resist such implacability." In this example, I link two quotes from each section and show them in context. They are underlined. In the second underlined quote, does this imply internal struggle or resistance to aggression? The reason I'm being so meticulous in my interpretation here is that there are many people who claim that she was assaulted in this scene, where I came away from it on the fence, given how poetic and unclear Williams was being with his writing. Why compare a Spidey's to a looming mountainside? Why does she cry out? Melodramatic expression in the face of internal struggle? Or because of something else? The whole sequence is written like this, with parts referencing her fear at points, and then switching to describe his beauty. It is obviously deliberate. I'm not bringing this up for no reason. To Green Angel Tower brings up the sequence again for obvious reasons. Miri mentions in dialogue that she wanted it. In other words, this book seems to take a side. At the same time, it was dialogue, and that dialogue has a context of its own, so that can be considered. We can also say that she was exaggerating at least a little. Even if she did want it, it was after he doggedly pressured her, which is untoward for a Spidey's in an other way entirely. Even then, the reader also has access to her internal thoughts. She never sees the event as a revocation of consent, but as her being deflowered. More importantly, she sees herself as responsible. Unfortunately, this doesn't say much either. If Williams understands how the concept of rape has changed over the centuries, he would know that in medieval times it was tied to property ownership on the part of the father or husband, and only changed to female agency in the last half century or so. He might just be writing for historical accuracy. Mary blames herself and even sees herself as unlovable. It is in this historical context that it happens. I could go on a tangent about recent attempts to acknowledge power differentials in the context of rape, which I am increasingly skeptical of, but I do ultimately think that it is what I said, a tangent. What matters for Williams' messaging is that Mary is situated in a society that punishes her for her sexual indiscretions, whether they are her choosing or not. Society does not know, nor does it care. That said, if he was going for a feminist angle, I think it would have hit home a little bit harder if Simon had gotten laid with another woman, or at least had rumors spread about his conquests to the opposite effect to make the point. As long as it isn't too heavy-handed, of course. Mary 3. There's one last thing I want to mention real quick, which is related to the last thing I just mentioned. In the very end, it is implied that Mary's reputation might come back to hurt her. But then it is quickly dropped, almost out of nowhere. I thought this should have been handled better. Other characters. Megwin's story was very strange, and it caught me off guard. At the very least, I was not expecting the story that I got. And like Mary's story, it was one of the darker stories in the book. In fact, I'm inclined to say it is the darkest. And the reason I consider it strange is because I don't entirely understand it. I don't understand the purpose of her arc. Maybe in like a plot sense I understand, of course. But like thematically, I guess I kept expecting her to upgrade to a full-fledged real character. But instead she remained in the interstices, neither truly full nor a background character. At the very least, she shows what war does to people. Cadric remains the hard hitter that he was. If you thought you learned a lot about him in the last book, it turns out the groundwork was only being laid. You learn much more about his character in this book, and he is even used as a tool to help build the world in more significant ways. His stormy relationship with Mary continues, as you can imagine, and there are a lot of ups and downs. Unfortunately, I cannot get into many of the specifics in the non-spoiler section. There was one thing I was hoping would happen with Pirazzi's character in the end of the story, or near the end. It had to do with some lore drops that came at the end of Stone of Farewell, which would have made the character more interesting and perhaps even terrifying. But what we get is predictable. All the same, it was no less satisfying. Elias, again, was underutilized. Now that I've finished the story, I can understand why he was used the way he was. But I really wish he could have been used in some of the many subplots. In other words, instead of doing what he did throughout Stone of Farewell, which was stand there and complain about waiting, almost like he was a reader, he could range out from the castle in the meantime. This could lead to clashes between him and Pirazzi's. Ending. As Williams demonstrated with the Dragonbone Chair, he is immensely capable of delivering satisfying endings to stories. We only see more of this in To Green Angel Tower. Stone of Farewell only failed because it had no real ending in any serious sense. It was just a bloated series of events that led up to, well, the third book, this book. The surprising thing is that the book ends very rapidly, at least in the context of, like, this massive tome. Williams is so caught up in all the story leading up to it that there isn't all that much build-up. I already mentioned that the approach to the Hay-Halt was very quick compared to the rest of the novel. Even then, everything seemed to come together all at once, and it's for a very specific in-world reason too. There is one plan that everything pivots around, and the actualization of this plan is what makes things happen. One of the most evident things about the ending as well is just how far the enemies got. They pretty much have everything in the bag, and when the time comes, they almost win. That aspect was well earned. And as usual, what leads to the conclusion and the victory of the heroes makes an important thematic point. Predictions. The funny thing about predictions is that I could have made many within the story, given that it was so large. I feel like I've read multiple stories. Many questions were posed and then answered in the same story. Too bad I just finished it all at once. As for the previous predictions, you'll have to wait for the spoiler section. Conclusion. Overall, I would say that this story managed to capture the essence of epic adventure fantasy well, without becoming too rambling, unlike its predecessor. It brought all of the story threads together in ways that were satisfying, and made the whole ride worth it, thankfully. I think I'll give this an 8 out of 10. Spoilers. Predictions. Well, I don't think any of my predictions held up. Aside from Simon becoming king, but who cares about that? That was obviously going to happen. I didn't really have much faith in my predictions either, though. Looking back on my predictions in my review of the Dragonbone chair, I thought that there was going to be more complexity between Joshua and his brother's wife. I thought that Joshua was being coy about his sexual relationship. Further, I thought that Miri might actually be his daughter. I went even further. I suggested that they might have nefarious intentions. All of this was wrong. It turns out that Joshua's former love for Miri's mother was barely ever touched upon again. However, he isn't actually the prince. He is the son of Kamaris, who was in a similar situation as Joshua, and apparently Kamaris actually gave in to the desire. Ironically, I never came up with a theory about the three swords. I just took for granted that they would do something, but I never tried to understand. I did start to generate my own theories as I was reading to Green Angel Tower. One was that maybe it was the sea people who were relevant. The swords were kind of a red herring. Yet it never crossed my mind that the three swords might actually be a tool to bring the Storm King back. Maybe I guessed it right before the actual reveal, but yes. This was a great twist. Ending. While I did find the ending satisfying, I think I can understand why someone might feel a little let down. This is because the Storm King essentially arrives and then is defeated all at once. But there is a logic to the events. He was still dependent on the means by which he was re-entering the world, so he was defeated at precisely the right point. He was at his most vulnerable. But another side of me wonders, if this had to be a 4-book trilogy, as it is often called, then why not remove Stone of Farewell and have the Storm King have his temporary victory, and then make the heroes recuperate in the last book? At that point, you could actually kill Joshua, make Simon the new leader, and have that set up for that last book. Another interesting twist that occurred to me during the Stone of Farewell, near the end of it, was when Amaterasu mentioned something about the Scythi gaining their immortality. I thought it would have been cool to explore that angle, and maybe even have Parates claim it for himself. Maybe his plan actually does work, but this is because he claims immortality for himself. Perhaps he could steal it, implying that someone, the Storm King maybe, or even the Scythi as a whole, lose it. At this point, I'm just rewriting the story. It did not need to be 4 books, and I found the ending to be satisfying. I just wanted to spitball some ideas, And there is another series after this one as well. So apparently the Scythe are explored more deeply. We'll see if or when I'll get to that. Not anytime soon. Conclusion. Overall, I would say that this story managed to capture the essence of epic adventure fantasy well, without becoming too rambling, unlike its predecessor. It brought all of the threads together in ways that were satisfying, and made the whole ride worth it, thankfully. I think I will give this an 8 out of 10.
I have now released both volumes of The Paths We Have Taken, which is the first arc in the Broken Reality. This is my grim, dark, epic horror fantasy series. It takes the political intrigue of A Song of Ice and Fire, the abrasive characterization of Abercrombie, the long-term storytelling of One Piece, and the philosophical horror of the Second Apocalypse to explore the human capacity for cruelty. Check it out if you are interested.